I'd like to get your opinion on something that was taught to me years ago when I was at school. It's about the controversial topic of world overpopulation. Now, hear me out. I realise that merely mentioning the topic is enough to earn me a great deal of hatred, and my defence is that these aren't necessarily my own views. This is only something that has been told to me, and I want your input to help me to know what to think. My geography teacher at school was a man called Mr. David Morris, and overpopulation was a particular hobby horse of his. This is how he taught it to us. Imagine that you can somehow quantify standard of living. Take all those indefinable qualities, such as salary, wealth level, and that most intangible of attributes, general happiness level, and in some way crunch them down to a number. Don't you ask me exactly how you do this. Mr. Morris was rather vague on exactly how this could be done, but let's gloss over that and just assume it can be done. My teacher's hypothesis was that for any closed system, such as an island community or a closed society where no one leaves or enters, North Korea maybe, the resources are necessarily limited. There's a finite amount of beneficial stuff, land, food, clean water, money or whatever, to be divided up amongst the population. Now, common sense indicates, or at least did to Dave Morris, that the more people there are, the less each person gets. The finite pie has to be cut up into ever thinner slices. The conclusion is therefore that there is a curve, the overpopulation curve he termed it, that imposes a limit on the average standard of living as population rises. If the population curve does exist, then nobody can be certain what shape it is, but it might look a little like this. On the vertical axis, you have standard of living, or quality of life if you prefer, reduced down to its simple number, and averaged over all the members of this closed community. On the horizontal axis, you have population, and there is the curve. For low populations, the curve permits a higher average standard of living. An increase in population, however, puts a ceiling on that figure. Now, various factors complicate this simplistic graph. Remember, it's average living standard we're talking about here. In any society, there will always be people who live like princes and people who live like paupers, with the paupers inevitably outnumbering the princes many times over. Similarly, it is very difficult to specify a completely closed system as, in just about any society, it is possible to bring in resources from outside and export both waste products and migrants. Effectively, if the population becomes too high, or the land becomes infertile, or the lakes run dry, the inhabitants simply move elsewhere. That has been the way of the world since civilization started. However, there is surely one ecosystem that is necessarily closed. This one. The planet has limited resources and a finite ability to sustain life. I'm not just talking about fossil fuels, which are necessarily finite. At one point, we will have pumped the last barrel of oil that we reasonably can. But also things like fresh water and land. While a large proportion of the Earth's surface is covered in water, it's either salt water or needs processing before it can be drunk. You might live within a few hundred yards of a freshwater river, but would you drink a cup of water straight out of that river? No, I thought not. As for land, well, you know what Mark Twain said on the matter. They're not making it anymore. This means that if we ruin our local environment, we will only be able to turn our backs on the mess we've made and move on a limited number of times. We can cut down the forests to build more houses, and concrete over the meadows to create roadways and runways. But once we've built as far as the sea in every direction, we'll have to stop. Suffice it to say that most of the resources the human race needs to sustain our technological society are finite in nature, and we're using them up. Of course, if space travel were cheap and commonplace, we could do what our ancestors have done up to now and leave the past as new. Could we escape into space and colonize other planets? Well, yes, in theory. But the past decades have taught us that even putting a small handful of people into low Earth orbit, never mind on the surface of another planet, is prohibitively expensive. Sorry, we're stuck here. There's also the concept of selling the family silver, the idea that we're using the world's resources, even the renewable ones, such as wood and fresh air, at an unsustainable rate, mortgaging standard of living in the future to pay for our present consumption. The fashion seems to be to enumerate how many Earths worth of resources we're consuming, or how many Earths we would need to make our current lifestyles sustainable. Figures vary, depending on which nation's lifestyle is used as a yardstick, from typically 1.1 Earths to 5.4 Earths. But with more and more societies adopting a high consumption view of life, the figure is rising. Any number of Earths above 1 is a sure sign that renewable resources are being used up and not replaced. Back to the graph. Of course, a low population does not guarantee a high average standard of living. In Shakespeare's day, for example, the world population was tiny compared to today, and yet people still emptied their chamber pots out of upper-story windows into the streets below. No, what that curve represents is an upper limit on standard of living for any given population. We might also find that improvements in science and technology lift this curve vertically upwards, allowing a higher average standard of living for the number of people alive. But it's still there as a ceiling that we would, at some point, inevitably bang our heads against. One thing that the model of overpopulation that this curve represents doesn't have is an automatic alarm bell that goes off when the population of the closed system hits a critical level. There's no explicit indicator that says, yes, now the planet's overpopulated. Instead, it is, in theory at least, always possible to move further along the curve, with the population increasing indefinitely and dragging the average living standard down as a result. As you can see, Dave Morris, the person who first laid this graph in front of me, was an unreconstructed Malthusian. But was he wrong? He defined overpopulation as follows. Overpopulation occurs whenever an increase in population leads to a decrease in average living standard. The question is the overpopulation curve that he proposed a real one? If so, have we as a society already hit it? Are there any scientific studies that would throw any light on this matter? I would dearly love to know what the YouTube community thinks of this. Please do tell me in the comments below.
Is he done yet? My arm's getting tired.
And now the bit you've all been waiting for, the part where I plug Rosemary's book. Behold, The Kelpie's Curse, a paranormal horror story set in rural Scotland. Click on the screen to see it on Amazon. I enjoyed it, and I think you will too.